Hey everyone, it's Jonathan and welcome to a very special episode. I'm joined today by Karen Fang, author of a brand new biography on Disney legend Tyrus Wong. Tyrus Wong is the artist directly responsible for the look of Walt Disney's Bambi. He was the background artist who painted the forest that's almost a character in and of itself in the film. Karen Fang's new book, Background Artist: The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong, chronicles the life of Tyrus from his voyage to the United States in 1920 at the age of 10, all the way through his 106-year-long life. As Bambi was my absolute favorite film as a kid, Tyrus Wong was probably one of the first artists beyond Walt himself that I actually learned the name of, and I've always loved the unique look and feel that his artwork brought to Bambi, and I was so excited to talk to Karen about this remarkable artist. Well, welcome. I'm excited to talk to you. Actually a fan of Tyrus Wong.
How long have you known about him? And
Since I was a teenager, Bambi was my
oh,
favorite
really?
movie as a kid. I
Uh-huh.
didn't know who he was when I was a little kid, but when
Yeah.
I got the DVD, probably early 2000s, whenever DVDs started taking over VHSs, I
Yeah.
got the DVD and watched all the bonus features, the making of features, and
Uh-huh.
learned about him. He was probably the first person beyond Walt Disney whose name I recognized,
That's
like as somebody who
amazing.
was worked on a Disney movie. Because I
That's
loved
wonderful.
Bambi, and
Uh-huh.
yeah, like I get emails from people asking about like publicity interviews for things, and for the most part, I don't do them because a lot of times it's like this really doesn't have anything to do with what I talk about, anyways. But I saw one come through. Someone wrote a book about Tyrus Wong, and I was like, okay, I have to do this one.
Well, thank you, because I tell everyone I'm the proselytizer for Tyrus because I just feel his story deserves to be heard by everybody because it's such an amazing story.
Yeah,
So I'm happy to talk to anybody, and I'm always thrilled to meet other people like you who feel the same way. So
yeah. Well, can you tell us about you and what you do and how you got to know Tyrus? I'm
yeah,
assuming you
so
didn't. Did you ever meet him?
no, I'm a film scholar, so I was sort of in the field, as we might say, and but I think like a lot of people, just like sort of the general audience, I really got clued into his story in 2016 when he passed.
Mm,
I had seen the documentary that had come out the year before by Pamela Tom, and I don't know if you know with she sort of discovered Tyrus the same way by watching the featurette
mm,
and discovering his and seeing his name. But so I had seen the documentary that he passed in 2016. There was so much coverage of him, right? Because he was 106,
hmm.
and it was such an amazing story. And so I was like everybody. A little bit was more intrigued, and then because I'm a film scholar, I realized I'd been running across his name a lot in sort of histories of animation, which animation is more important now than ever, I think,
Hmm.
and certainly in the sort of Asians in Hollywood sort of recovery work that's been going on. And so, I was really interested. And once with the documentary, because it's a documentary, there's only so much you can get into 90 minutes. And so, once once I started poking around and I sort of learned about the fine arts career, the WPA, the greeting cards, Warner Brothers, I just thought like, there needs to be, as an academic, I thought there needs to be uh, a full length book that covers the entirety of his career and
Hmm.
his whole life. And I think a book can do things differently too, right?
Hmm.
And so I was immediately sort of like just committed to this idea. I of a biography because I also just sort of thought that like telling his story, like the documentary, is a way of making it universal, right? I didn't
Hmm.
want to just do a dry academic study
And
because
it's
I
not
think
that.
it's,
It's like
yeah,
I haven't. I only got it earlier this week, so I haven't gotten too far into it. But it's really interesting. It's like an actual story. It's not dry at all.
thank you. That's really what I was going for because I just think that you never meet anyone who once they hear their story is not captivated and inspired and touched by it, right? And that's what I wanted to that's what I was trying to go for. You had the advantage of already knowing about him, but
Hmm.
I hope that everybody sort of has that same feeling about him once they get to know him.
Yeah, definitely. Well, can you tell us a bit about Well, I could maybe start with his early life, like how he came to the US, because like he came to the US during a period of time that was like really hard. I mean, hard times and all, but like especially for like Asian Americans moving to the US, he came during a particularly difficult time. Can you tell us a bit about that time and what he had to
Sure.
overcome to get here?
Yeah, so he came in the period that's known as Chinese exclusion, and this is a period that was really important in American history, but importantly, is not often taught in
Hmm.
schools, and so many people don't know about it. But Chinese exclusion was a federal policy, a U.S. policy, a policy by the U.S. government to systematically restrict the entry of ethnic Asians to the U.S. And it started the policy began in 1882 and it continued till 1943. But it really sort of began earlier after the completion of the transcontinental railroad. So all these Chinese had been sort of recruited by American industrialists to build the railroad. And then after the railroad was done, nobody wanted ethnic Asians in anymore, and so that there was actually sort of a violent period of sort of aggressive harassment, and then ultimately this policy, and so during the Chinese exclusion period. Any ethnic Asian who hoped to enter into the U.S. had to submit to really rigorous kinds of bureaucratic documentation and expectations. There are much higher expectations about literacy, of bringing in of wealth, of capital. So particularly when you can compare it to the people who are coming across the Atlantic in Ellis Island. So the ethnic Asians who were coming across the Pacific and going through Angel Island, there were only a few classes of ethnic Asians who were really allowed to enter the U.S. at all. These were students, religious workers, or the merchant class. So these are people who were people who are going to be owning businesses,
Hmm.
and they would have to bring huge amounts of documentation to sort of to show this. And often they were detained in Angel Island for weeks on end while they submitted to rigorous interrogations to prove their identity. And then if they were then allowed to enter the U.S., if they passed all these tests, they would have to continue to carry paperwork with them at all times. They would be restricted usually in most places, most cities they were restricted to where they could live. They were restricted what schools they could attend. You couldn't vote. You couldn't marry outside your race. Like you couldn't testify in court against a white person. You couldn't own or rent land in many cases. So there were really marginalized, socially and legally marginalized. So Tyrus arrived in the U.S. In 1920, and so like many Chinese, he arrived with doctored identity papers to present himself as a member of the merchant class. In order to do that, and he was separated from his father, who had already established his credentials in the U.S. His father had been in the U.S. for some time already, and so when they passed through Angel Island, they were separated. His father was allowed to land in the U.S. and Tyrus, who was at that time a 9 or 10 year old boy, was then taken to Angel Island. And so, can you imagine being a
Hmm.
child, sent to this detention center where you don't speak the language, you know, and he has no relation with him. And then he ends up staying there a month, which was a standard stay at Angel Island at that time. And fortunately, he passes his interrogation exam and is allowed to enter. But he still won't even become a citizen for another 25 years, another quarter century,
Yeah.
until the law changes and Asian immigrants are allowed to become naturalized citizens.
So between his coming to the US and Disney, I guess, can you tell us about anything like don't give the whole book away, but like anything specific that we should know that happened between then and Disney?
Well, I think Bambi Disney is forever the thing that
Hmm.
Tyrus will always be remembered for because it's so iconic. I mean, like you were saying, right? Our childhoods would be completely different if
Yeah.
Bambi didn't exist, and we owe Bambi to Tyrus. As um, I won't give it away, but my book talks about like how Bambi was, stalled. They weren't making any progress until Tyrus came along. But what's important to know is that before Tyrus came to Disney, he was already an established fine artist who was really developing a reputation in Southern California at the time before he went to the movie studios. And so he had graduated, he had been a scholarship student to the Otis Art Institute, where he was immediately recognized as a really unique student. He graduates in 1932 and he immediately starts showing his work and is getting reviewed in the Los Angeles Times. And then by 1936 has joined the WPA, President Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, this Depression era effort, to revitalize the economy by, among other things, like employing artists to create works of art for the nation. And so he's doing these, he has these high prestige exhibitions, like really all around California and even in Chicago and even in Paris. So he was already this established, rising fine artist before he goes to the movie studios. But remember, this is the Depression. It's the 1930s. It's hard to make a living as an artist at any time, especially to imagine to doing it as a Depression. And then imagine you're a non-white, non-citizen, right? And then he was newly married and they were expecting their first child. And so he makes the practical decision, as most immigrants have to take a good job, which of course was Disney.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a bit about what he did at Disney before Bambi? Because like his role on Bambi wasn't really what he was hired for.
Right. Yeah. So he is hired initially as an in-betweener. So almost everybody at Disney starts at an entry-level position. This was sort of the Disney policy, right? And particularly at this moment, right after Snow White. So Snow White had come out in early 1937. It's transformed Hollywood. It's the most interesting animation studio in the U.S. and really sort of like one of the most interesting places to be in Hollywood in general, because nobody had thought it was possible to do a feature-length animated film, right? And so Walt is, always ambitious, like wanting to capitalize on, on this momentum. He's hiring all these artists from all over the world. And so the Disney studios are growing, but he still starts almost everybody at these entry-level positions. So for example, Tyrus's friend, William Jackson, who was another early important figure in Disney and was a classmate of Tyrus's, at Otis initially started as a janitor even. So, I mean, that was another trained fine artist. And but Tyrus comes in, he's hired as an in-betweener. So, in these early days of animation, how do they create the illusion of moving imagery, right? They have to, as everyone knows, it's like the flipbook situation where you have to create multiple images of basically the same image, right, with only the tiny changes, so that when all of these images are projected in sequence, it creates the illusion of movement. And so you would have these very skilled draftspeople whose job is only just to reproduce the keyframes that are drawn by the chief animators. Mm-hmm. And so that's where Tyrus starts. And I mean, and remember, this is a guy who's already been reviewed in the LA Times as a rising artist. He had been hired in the WPA as a semi-professional. So in this, very relatively high rank, he had fine art prints shown at the Art Institute in Chicago, where Matisse and Picasso had been shown. So, it's not the kind of thing that Tyrus sort of, expected to be doing, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, he, like I said earlier, he's a practical guy. He's an immigrant. He wants to provide for his family. So it was a huge sort of discrepancy between what he had been doing, what he was capable of doing, and what he was doing upon his initial start at Disney.
Yeah. So was there like something that happened that made him make that transition, like from being the in-betweener to the background artist?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, there were all these problems with Bambi, right? I mean, if you think about it, Snow White had already been this major innovation, right? To imagine human characters, to draw characters, and to give them enough movement and enough life and personality that you could hold audiences' attention and investment
Hmm.
for the duration of a feature film. And then suddenly Walt says, we're going to do it with a story all about animals, right? And not just even one animal, right? But like multiple different types of animals. So you've got to master all of the different animal shapes. You've got to make them, they all animals have different faces and they
Hmm.
all move differently. So as a sheer technical problem, how do you create that kind of movement? And then you want to do the Snow White thing, which is make each animal character like relatable, right? They have to have
I remember
personality.
that in probably the same DVD talking about the difference between Snow White and Bambi. Because, like, if you, most of the animals that are in Bambi are in Snow White, but they look totally different. Like,
Right.
I remember the whole thing about them, like, bringing in live animals to study into
Yeah.
like, they had the baby deer in with the animators the other
Yeah,
day.
they had like a sort of like menagerie at the
Hmm.
studios, and so and people, you and your fan listeners like all know about the sort of the Disney life drawing classes, right? Where Walt was like so committed to sort of cultivating like the illusion, this mastery of human movement, that they had all these life drawing classes like in the studios. And then once they start working on Bambi, they have, in addition to the human life drawing classes, they also have the animal life drawing
Hmm.
classes, right? Where they have live baby deer, live baby rabbits. And but of course what happens is the production of the film just goes on for years, and so they're constantly having to replace the animals because they grow up and they die, you know um, and stuff. But but it just goes to show like just what an extraordinary technical challenge Bambi was proving to be. It was, I think, of an exponential degree beyond what Snow White had been.
Yeah. So he moved into like the background paintings because I remember learning about him and then wondering what else he did for Disney, but he doesn't really have much. Like, he didn't do this beyond Bambi. Like, he didn't, like, because you kind of expect, like, oh, now he's going to be the background painter, but then he wasn't. So, can you tell us a bit about him moving on from Disney?
Yeah. Do you want to know like why he moves on, or just
Sure.
So, so Bambi was so important for the studios that it was actually sort of it was Walt's pet project, literally, and it was so important that Walt actually kept them in a separate location from the rest of the studio artists at the time. And so when Tyrus is sort of moved from in betweening to the Bambi project, he's working only on Bambi, as many of the other Bambi artists are. And what Tyrus is doing is what is essentially called nowadays is a concept artist or an inspiration sketch artist, where he's reading the story and just sort of creating these one-off single images to set to give a sort of set uh, an example of the mood or tone of the scene, right? So, like, this is what the meadow should look like in the forest. This should be the feeling of the forest fire, right? This is how to convey the coldness of winter or something. So he's just making these single inspiration sketches, and he loves doing this because this is so much closer to what he had been
Hmm.
doing as a fine artist, right? Like creating like these single images, as he says, from his own mind, my own imagination, right? So he's coming back to being a true artist and not just being the sort of copyist, which is what he'd been doing as an in-betweener. But what happens is, of course, because Bambi takes so long, there's a lot of things happening in Hollywood at the time, and eventually there's the Disney animator strike
Mm.
with a lot of changes in the studio, and Walt ends up, so many people are let go from the studio during the time, around the time of the strike, and Tyrus ends up being one of them. Um, and nobody knows exactly why, right? I mean, probably it was a 3-year contract was standard for Disney. Initial contract was standard at the time, and so his
Hmm.
his contract was up. The studio, it was during the war at this time, so the studio is trying to after hiring all those people after Snow White, they're also trying to tighten belts at this point.
Yeah.
And then remember, because Tyrus had only been working with Bambi, there's a way that people maybe just didn't know who he was, right? Tyrus
Hmm.
never met Walt, even though he was so important to
Hmm.
the Bambi project. So, a number of conditions, I think, sort of conspired such that this person who had been so instrumental to Bambi, ends up being, let go. Like
Hmm.
many important people were lost to the
Yeah.
studio at that time.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that I've always just wondered, like, why was he included in the people who were let go? Because, like, he is the reason Bambi looks like it does. Like, his paintings are amazing. And if it
Yeah.
were me, I would want more of that for my movies.
Yeah. It's so much of Hollywood, right, has these stories, right, of
Yeah.
geniuses who there's a moment where you catch lightning in a bottle, all the condition, all the stars align, and we're lucky that there's a record of that. And then, unfortunately, people don't capitalize it. But I mean, there's so many amazing things that the people who ended up leaving Disney from the strike went on to also do amazing stuff as well. So.
Yeah.
And Tyrus, of course, goes on to Warner Brothers.
Yeah, I
So,
was going to ask about that because I don't know much about that period. So he moved to Warner Brothers and worked on a lot of movies.
yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about like some of the most interesting or important ones that he might have done?
So he works on The Music Man towards the end, in the 60s, Camelot, the Wild Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch is the last film that he does. Um, he works on a bunch of John Wayne films. Actually, when he's on loan to Republic, so not at Warner Brothers. He works on several Doris Day films. He works on, um, gosh, I'm forgetting it all right now. But I mean, going to Warner Brothers is so different from Disney. Disney was working on like one film. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not just a difference between animation and live action, right? It's a difference between a boutique studio and a major studio, right?
Yeah.
So Warner Brothers, like, they're just churning out these movies, particularly during the war period. And so, Tyrus is working on multiple films at a time, right? Working for different art directors. There's not the same sort of like careful cultivation of intellectual property that's happening at Disney, but then it's also giving him more freedom in a sense.
Hmm.
Because he can work on all these different things. He can take the sketches home. He can sign them, right? Which is, what you wasn't allowed to do at Disney. So.
Yeah. So did he make anything that like showed up in the movies, or was it mostly concept art?
Oh, that's a great question. So at Warner Brothers, he's hired in the art department as a motion picture sketch artist. So he is doing concept art, and then that's the higher ranking studio artist, right? So he's
Hmm.
not just a storyboard artist. If he was a storyboard artist, he'd be a draftsman. But it's a sign again of his reputation, right? Having come off of Bambi, that he's hired at the higher level
Hmm.
as his entry position. But at a place like Warner Brothers, where they're, like I said earlier, just making so many movies all the time, and you're a contract hire, you're just expected to do whatever. So in addition to doing the motion picture sketches for individual film projects, he sometimes does storyboards, but every now and then he's asked to do credit art or prop art. And so there
Mm.
are definitely wonderful moments when you can sort of see in the film, like, little things that he did, when there's like a painting in the background or something that Tyrus did, or like in the credits of films. So I talk in the book about a Doris Day film. I'll See You in My Dreams, I think is the title. And it's a period piece about this songwriter. I can't remember the name right now, but Doris Day plays the wife of the songwriter and a singer. And so there's a scene where she's in a music hall and she's like leading the audience through singing the songs, and the music hall has on the screen like these sort of paintings with with the lyrics so the audience can sing along with the lyrics. But the picture that are being projected on the screen with the lyrics are actually Tyrus's paintings, and so there's wonderful sort of moment where, there's essentially a movie within a movie, right? Because you're
Okay.
seeing in this film an audience watching an image on the screen, and the image that they're watching on the screen behind Doris Day is Tyrus's paintings, right? So it's the background for the big star, right, at that moment is Tyrus's art. And you see
Hmm.
this over and over again, these wonderful moments where Tyrus's paintings are doing the backgrounds for the title art. And one of my great finds in my research was uh, the biopic. I think it's starring Anne Bancroft, the Helen Morgan story, where Tyrus actually appears on screen in a scene that's sort of the Helen Morgan story is a story about this sort of Broadway torch singer. And so in an early sequence of the film where it's showing that she's an artist with a sort of bohemian, like eclectic, I don't know if it's set in the East Village or someplace, like, sort of like artsy bohemian crowd. There's like a party and the camera pans around the room to show the party scene, and there's Tyrus there front and center sketching,
Oh,
and so
cool.
yeah, the Tyrus himself didn't. He thought he had been cut out of the film. He must never have actually seen the final version. So
Hmm.
in his interviews, he talks about. He's like, he jokes about like, oh, I guess I was too ugly. They cut me out or something. But I had decided when I was researching the film that I was just going to try to watch every movie that I knew that he had worked on. So I was like sitting here watching this movie, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's Tyrus. And this again is a sort of wonderful example of, you know, at a big studio like Warner Brothers, particularly if you're a below the line artist, right? So somebody who's hired for production, but your name is not on the movie poster as like a major as production talent. Like, these people, they don't really, they're kind of in the background too, right? In the sense, but when it came to this, when the studio wanted to pick an artist to do something different and distinct and memorable, or when they were looking for somebody to embody the artist, the idea of an artist, that's what Tyrus is doing in that moment, in that scene in the
Yeah.
Helen Morgan story.
That's really cool that he's actually doing art in the film.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll have to look for that one. I also, oh, I'm gonna have to look for Camelot too, because that I put on my list probably for next year. I have a different podcast called Every Version Ever, and I'm planning a series on doing a bunch of different versions of the King Arthur mythos. So that's on my
Uh-huh.
list. What did he do on that film? Was anything on screen that I can look for, or was it just concept art?
It was just concept art, but it was what was so fun was so again like life at a studio at a big studio and during the golden age of the studio era, right? Like it's just so fascinating to see the inner workings of movies while they're in production. And so one of the things that was like so fun for me was to like go back and look at the production files of these movies that Tyrus worked on at Warner Brothers. And so if you were, Warner Brothers had this great research department. If you're doing a historical film, costume drama, whatever, that was the job of the research department was to like find, reference images for the artist to like, provide sort of historical review of the script, right? And also to be on set to like eyeball, the scenes and costume, the set and costumes for accuracy. And so as one of the studio sketch artists, Tyrus was often sending these memos to the research department to ask for reference images. And so it was great to see these sort of like these requests that coming in like logged to his name that he had requested like I quote it in the book, like he had requested like maps of France and Italy, like a garden with like French French vegetation, like what swords and scabbards look like, and then he has at one point a request for like fantastic trees, so you know, it's just Camelot. was one of the last big studio films, right? I mean, Warner Brothers actually sold a year or two later. Um,
Mm.
and so it was just, it's wonderful to watch, to see like every cog in the studio machine.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll definitely be paying more attention for his influence when I'm watching that one. So after he's moved on from Warner Brothers, was that the last that he did with movies, or did he do anything beyond that?
So he retires from Warner Brothers like a few years after that. Life had been good for him. Like he felt that he was ready to retire. He retired in '68, so he was only 58 at the time. Um, but one of the things I talk about in the book, and what was always one of the most interesting things to me about Tyrus's story, was his greeting cards, the Christmas cards
That
the
was going to be
best-selling
my
Christmas
next question
cards.
because I didn't realize that he had done that.
Yeah, so he, had started doing the Christmas cards like the whole time that he's in Hollywood, and this was actually very common for commercial artists at the time. A lot of just among his his former colleagues at Disney, a number of people were all doing Christmas cards or greeting cards because the 50s through the 70s is widely known as the golden age of greeting cards. This is
Mm,
like this peak moment in American history when, for a lot of different reasons, a lot of people are buying and selling Christmas cards. So it was a really good opportunity for a lot of commercial artists to be creating images. And so Tyrus gets invited to do this, and just unexpectedly, his unique designs really take off. And so for the next 20 some years, this whole time that he's at Warner Brothers, he's also making greeting cards, and he actually continues this for several years past his retirement as well. And at his peak, he's hired by Hallmark. And he's often, for the various greeting card companies he works for, he's often, their best-selling artist that year. He gets fan mail from people who love his cards, or like looking to see the next sequence for the collection for the next year. They want to buy the original sample art. When I was doing research, I would hear from people who had always collected them every year, would get the new
mm,
Tyrus Wong cards. And this is, I think, such, it's so fascinating, this story, because first of all, if you see the cards, it's distinctly Tyrus's style with this sort of Oriental Chinese style brushwork,
hmm
applied to Western Christian imagery,
mm.
right? So this Chinese style brushwork doing a Christmas tree, an angel. He even has Asian looking angels. Like, he does a bonsai tree with Christmas ornaments. So it's just, he's consistently sort of like insisting on biculturalism,
hmm
right? That you can be both Asian and American, right? Which is who he sees himself as. It's certainly
hmm
how he and his family like went through life, right? But what's amazing is that they were hugely popular. That they were so popular that he was such a best-selling artist, and because of his success, he is able to insist that the cards are always sold with his name. That his artist contracts, they're always printed with his signature. The artist contracts provide that they cannot crop or remove his signature from the image, right? They must be sold. If they're sold in a collection, that his cards have to come first in the collection, right? So, I mean, this is really significant. If you think
hmm
about, as I talked about earlier, the sort of background artist or a below the line artist,
hmm
right? Who's usually anonymous. Actually, the greeting cards were the source of his greatest fame in his own lifetime.
That is really cool. I've never thought about greeting card artists getting fan mail, but that is very cool that he did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it tells you something both about the importance of greeting cards and his extraordinary success with that genre, right? And I think it's really easy for there's this tendency, I think, culturally for people to sort of like, Shaw greeting cards, it's Hallmark, right? Because we think it's like sort of mass market, like mass
hmm
manufactured stuff, but that ignores the fact that for many people, it's probably the most intimate form of encounter with art they have, right? If people are not necessarily, not all people go to museums,
hmm
right? But almost everybody gives or receives a greeting card, right? So the impact of greeting card art is really important. And then again, remember, not only are the greeting cards fascinating because they're, they're he's popularizing this Asian style, his signature style, right? That
Hmm.
he's doing this right after China, they've just lifted the exclusion laws. So I said earlier, the first quarter century of his life in the United States, he can't even become a citizen. He has to carry his documents with him everywhere he goes, right? In case somebody questions whether he has a right to be in the U.S. And then all of a sudden, the laws change, and he becomes so successful with these greeting cards that everybody's demanding to have a little piece of him through these paper pieces, right? I mean, like,
Hmm.
think of it's such a wonderful sort of reversal
Yes.
of fortune, right?
Yeah, I'm sure that must have been very validating.
Yeah.
It's very cool that he was able to get the contracts to stipulate that they leave his signature in too, so that
Yeah.
people know. Because, like, I don't think of that when I go to buy a greeting card. I just look for one that looks nice. I don't really think about who might have drawn it. That is
Right,
very
right,
cool that he got that.
right. No, I mean, he became a collector's item.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, after Hallmark, can you tell us a bit about the later stages of his life? Because there was something with kites that I read about. So can you tell us a bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I mean, so Tyrus is so amazing, just sort of like relentlessly creative, like always just sort of like always interested in the next new thing, and never it was never a snob about different kinds of media, right?
Hmm.
And so when he retires, as I said earlier, he retires a little bit early, and this is somebody who, remember, he'd been like working in the studios and at the same time conducting this enormously successful greeting card, sideline. He'd also been taking commissions, fine art commissions, and like doing other things. I mean, again, I think this comes from this kind of immigrant industriousness, right? That he was just sort of willing and able to do lots of things all the time. So when he retires, he's kind of like, well, now what do I do? And so his wife, as a joke, sort of says, "Oh, go fly a kite." Because she just wants him out of her hair, basically, and he thinks like, well, yeah, kites are a Chinese invention, right?
Hmm.
And this is again Tyrus sort of like in his own quiet way, always sort of like proudly perpetuating Chinese heritage and culture, right? And he's also just a playful guy, and he's very
Hmm.
active. And so he says he decides that he's going to start like designing kites. And then, of course, for this endlessly creative person, it's not just like oh, I'm going to like get go to the store and buy some craft, go to the craft store and buy a kit. Like he cuts his own bamboo, he bends them over flame, right? He finds different kinds of experiments with different materials, right? Often sort of found materials and stuff, because why spend money on stuff if you could, find it? And he starts developing, kites that are, really beautiful and unique. And he ultimately sort of develops like this regular thing of once a month just flying them on Santa Monica Beach. And he sort of, invites people to join him, his family, his friends. He really, very quickly becomes known in the sort of kite enthusiast community for his kites. And so people all over the area would come to join him for his kite flies. And so there were, when he was alive in these later years, there were a lot of people in the LA area, because, he had outlived so many generations, right? That there were a lot
Hmm.
of people who knew him as the kite man of Santa Monica Beach, and had no idea that he'd had this incredible, Hollywood history, and that he
Hmm.
was this, best-selling greeting card artist. But, like you would be walking on the beach, and people would like we see these kites, and they would linger, and then they'd like come back, and stuff. And so the kites becomes this wonderful thing of like a kind of accessible art, right? That's visible to everybody, and like sort of fosters a new kind of community as well.
Hmm. Yeah, he lived quite a long time. I think that's probably one of the things that stood out to me, like back in the day when I was watching those behind the scenes things. And maybe that's why he stuck in my head so much, because he was still, at the time, he was still alive. Because, like,
Yeah,
in my head, watching all the old Disney movies, everybody had passed on. Like, Walt Disney had passed on. Like, I think probably just as a kid, I just assumed that everyone who had made those movies had passed, but he hadn't at the time.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I mean, he lived to 106, so I mean, there's almost nobody who lived as long as he did,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, I think it's such a fascinating story, and but it's also, I think it's a sort of it's a testament to his particular viewpoint and his
Hmm.
perspective on life and the sort of resilience and transcendence and stuff. But there were a lot of, as you know, there were a lot of artists and like Disney creatives. A lot of people either die early or they live really long. So
Kinda, yeah.
that's another reason why his story is so inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, is there anything else in the book that you think is really important to touch on before we end talking about Tyrus and his life? Because we don't want to give away everything in the book, of course.
Right. No, I mean, no, unless if you have other questions, I really just hope, I mean, I would encourage people to just, flip through and read whatever they want to read. Like, I mean, I hope that you read all of it, but, and I know this is a Disney podcast. And so people may be most interested in the Disney, but I mean, I just feel that like every chapter of his life is so fascinating.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really, one of the things that was amazing for me writing and researching was like realizing like how he transformed the lives of so many other people through his spirit and through his creativity and the way that he fostered community and connection. And that is, I think it's such a model, it's such an inspiration. And I hope like that's a sort of takeaway for people. And I think that's one of the things that you get if you read the whole book, is how you see this at every decade, at every moment, and in every
Hmm.
creative circle that he moves through. So that's something I really hope people will look out for. And the other thing I will say, I don't know how many of your listeners are in California, or sort of our audiobook listeners, but the audiobook is also really good. And so, because it is a long book, the guy lived a long time. So, you know,
I was
if
surprised when I received it in the mail because I got the package. I was like, "Is this it? This is heavy."
and we were also lucky to get so many illustrations in.
Yeah, that
Um,
surprised me too. That is such a cool addition to the book.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I hope people, get the print book. I hope they listen to the audiobook. I mean, I just like I said earlier, I'm just really just committed to trying to share Tyrus's story with the world, because I don't know anybody who learns of it and isn't transformed by it.
Hmm. Well, do you have time for some non-Tyrus related questions? Because I wrote down a few
Absolutely.
just for you, because this is an animation podcast and a Disney podcast,
Yeah.
and you're a film scholar, so I thought maybe you would have a few things to talk about. I was just wondering, like, because this is about a person who worked for Disney. Are you a Disney fan yourself? Did you grow up watching the movies?
Oh, yeah. I actually, when I was applying for college, I wrote an essay about, like, I think there was the essay prompt was like, what is your dream job? And I wrote my essay prompt of like, when I become the CEO of Disney.
So, what were your favorites growing up?
Well, I mean, Bambi, I think, is one of the first
Mm.
animated movies I remember seeing. I remember my parents took me and my older brother to a drive-in, and I remember
Oh,
us
that's
sitting
cool.
in the back of our station wagon with like sleeping bags and watching. You'd put the little radio thing in the window of the car and watching Bambi at a drive-in. But I will say that for lots of different reasons, like I also have a deep fondness for the rescuers.
Oh,
So
yes, that's another one of my favorites.
yeah, and I just, I rewatched The Rescuers like last year with my kids, and having done all this Disney research now, like The Rescuers is like even more meaningful to me now. Like thinking about all of the creative people who had behind it, and like the little things that were going on, like Wooly Reitherman, who had been the sort of lead animator for The Rescuers, and sort of like the bird, the albatross,
Hmm.
right? And the sort of flying sequence, and knowing that Willie Reitherman had been a pilot in the war and that he like continued to fly recreationally
Mm.
afterwards. Like, I had always loved that flying sequence, like as a kid, but then knowing the backstory of the
Hmm.
animator behind that sequence, like made it even more meaningful. And I mean, for the same reason, like watching Bambi now, right? To know the stories behind everything. I mean, to know the
Hmm.
sad story of um, is it Frank Churchill or who did the music? What is his name? He killed
I
himself. Like,
I think so. I haven't read up on the rescuers recently, so I can't remember for sure.
no, I'm thinking about the person who did the music for Bambi. I want to say it's Frank Churchill, but like I'm also wondering if
Oh yeah,
that's also
you're
the
right.
name
You're
of
right. Yeah,
somebody. Is it Frank
I
Churchill?
think so. I'll
Okay.
check just to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it is.
Okay, because I think Frank Churchill's also the name of a character in an Austen novel, so now I'm like confused. But at any rate, so that was a sad story. He like shot himself, like I think shortly after Bambi finished, and you say
Yes.
you know when you think, or then also you know you think of these Cyrus Yang, the Chinese another Chinese immigrant at Disney who had done a special effects animator who had done the water droplets in the April
Mm.
shower sequence,
Oh yeah.
you know, and so, you know, Bambi is a work of art for anyone when you
Hmm.
see it, but then to know these backstories of all the creators behind it, it just makes it so meaningful. And then I will also say that I urge everyone, if you can, to see Bambi in film, projected on film, because it's not the same to see it digitally projected, to see it come or not projected to come to played from a digital medium
Hmm.
rather than from film. If you can, I like if you can see it on 35 millimeter, it's amazing.
That would be cool. I don't know that there's a way I could do that right now, but if I ever got the opportunity, I definitely would.
Right, agitate. I'm telling people agitate for your local movie theater to get them to do their repertory screening for because the wonderful thing about Bambi is there's always new kids who need
Yeah,
to see it.
yeah. No, that it's still one of my favorites. Like for whatever reason, like that everyone talks about Bambi traumatizing them as a kid. I was never traumatized. I loved that movie so much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was exactly the same. It was funny, like um, so when my book launched, when it came out, like we were able to have a 35 millimeter screening here at the
Oh,
Museum of
that's
Fine Arts in
cool.
Houston here, and I was surprised at the number of people who were like, "I'm not coming to see that because I was traumatized when I was a kid." you know, so
I think not that I was traumatized, but I was almost more traumatized by the pheasant than Bambi's mom. I don't know why.
yeah,
Maybe it's that you saw her on screen, but like, and
yeah,
it didn't traumatize me, but that was like probably the most shocking thing for me.
yeah, yeah. I will say that the thing that's never sat well with me, and it still bothers me. Probably bothers me even more now as I'm a grown woman. Is like the Twitter pated big sequence because it just makes it makes the female animals to be these like seductresses,
Oh yeah.
you know. And I just don't think that's fair.
So beyond Disney, do you have any other favorite animated films, either from childhood or more recently?
Well, I mean, like everybody, I think Miyazaki is
Oh
amazing,
yes.
right? And I mean, I think it's so important to have like this different sense of what animation can do, right?
Hmm.
We shouldn't, you know, wonderful as Disney is, right? It's become so influential that people tend to think use animation and kid pick
Hmm.
interchangeably, right? Which is, you know, it's a misunderstanding of the capacities of the medium,
Yeah.
right? So Miyazaki, I think you know the Pixar stories, which are you know have a sort of different feel, even though Pixar you know is under the Disney umbrella.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and I mean, I love stop motion.
Mm.
You know, anybody who's doing stop motion in this day and age, like I take my hat off to them. So
Yeah. There's not enough. I talk about this with other people doing the random stop motion movies. Like, we need more of this.
yeah, yeah,
It's such a cool medium.
yeah.
What's your favorite Miyazaki movie? Mine is Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. I love that movie so much.
I don't know which was my favorite.
They're all really good in their own ways, but
Yeah,
there's something about Nausicaa that just, I don't know, it's so cool. I
yeah.
love things that take you to a different world, and Nausicaa is such a different world to our own.
Yeah, yeah. I think probably Howl's Moving Castle, just
Hmm.
because I'm just so I feel so strongly about sort of like the environmental narrative. I think that's a sort of really accessible one, but I mean, yeah, I think they all have this sort of like distinct sort of way of transporting you to this different world. And I also just like the way that they inhabit this moment in life, which is a little bit past, which is past childhood,
Hmm.
but it still holds on to like this kind of wonder and innocence and
Yeah.
hopefulness, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's also cool that, I mean, there's magic involved, and it's not everything as it seems, but it's like an older character. You don't really get too many movies with an older protagonist.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so much of animation in the American context is like doesn't can't imagine a life past 12, right? And I think like what's so fascinating about Miyazaki is it sort of like intentionally sits in this kind of like adolescent phase, which is an awkward time, but also like I said, like this really important time because
Mm,
the person is sort of thinking outside of themselves, like thinking about their relationship to the world, and like recognizing sort of moral quandaries and
hmm.
naming them in ways that are there's a room. Miyazaki allows a space for ambivalence that we don't normally see in American movies targeted for kids.
Yeah. Yeah. His movies are so different to American movies. It's,
Yeah.
I, like he always says, this is my last one, but I hope there's more coming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will also say, because I'm Chinese American, that there are some wonderful, there's a Hong Kong animated film called, of course, you should have, if I know these questions beforehand, I would have like looked them up because I can't, there's a pig in a Hong Kong animated film about this pig and McDole, My Life is McDole. And this is wonderful because it's McDowell is like a pig raised by a single mom. They live in those sort of like working class housing projects, and so it's just like really this sort of like really like modest life. It's like the experience of like most people in Hong Kong, right? So if you're a fan of Hong Kong film, like we all think that like there's all these like glamorous shootouts happening and people walking in slow motion like Chow Yun Fat or something like that, right? But then My Life as McDowell like has this really like sort of like whimsical view of what life is like for most people, right? Where they sort of like life on the margins, but they still have hope and they
Hmm.
find sort of like sustenance and like connection in their community and stuff. That's a sort of really wonderful film. And then there's also another film whose name I totally cannot remember, but it's set in Taiwan. And I think it goes back and forth between the contemporary period and the past. And it might actually be like begin from the perspective of like a sort of transnational Asian American woman, like her child of immigrants who like goes back or something. But anyhow, it goes back and forth between the modern period and like Taiwan from earlier. And so for me, it's really compelling because that's my experience. Like, sort of imagining like what life had been like for my parents. My parents are Taiwanese immigrants, but it also is just like My Life as McDowell, like these sort of wonderful applications of animation to a space and time
Hmm.
that like is not usually seen by American or by Western consumers. And
Hmm.
and because it's animation, the kind of like imagination that's allowed when you draw something rather than photograph something, right, is just
Yeah.
wonderful.
I'll have to look those up because that's one thing that I really like about a lot of Miyazaki's work. Not all of it, of course, but like the slice of life, just using animation to tell a simple story because you hardly ever get that in American animation. It's always got to be something huge and action packed and exciting, which is fine. Those I like those too, but like the slice of life stuff is sometimes it can be more compelling, and I really like that. So I'll have to look those up.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's these Taiwan and then My Life as McDowell, they're really wonderful because they're urban films. Like, in Hong Kong and Taipei. And they're really like they're recognizable spaces. Like a lot of times with the Miyazaki films, like they're kind of like um, spaces for fables,
Hmm.
right? So like they're spaces that like function for a significant metaphorical point, but you
Yeah.
can't place them in time or space necessarily. Whereas like when you watch these two other films that I'm talking about, like exactly where you are in Hong Kong or in Taipei at what moment in time, and so it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to look those up. Well, I have one more question that's kind of random, but it's a question that I always like asking people. Like growing up, like of course I loved animation, but I also, for whatever reason, I loved like obscure old Disney comedies. So, are there any old or more obscure? And I guess it doesn't have to be Disney, but like my favorites were like the computer wore tennis shoes, or even ones that aren't technically good, like the Shaggy DA, like
Oh my
the random
God.
stuff. I love those things. So I always like to ask people if they have any favorites of like old random movies like that.
It's so funny that you mentioned the Shaggy DA because everyone thinks this is hilarious. Like to me, like the Shaggy DA is the movie that traumatized me as a kid because I could not sleep for days after the Shaggy DA because I was horrified as a kid at this idea that like you could suddenly just turn into something else, right? Like not that you had no control over your like species, that all of a sudden you could like be a human and then a dog was like really, I mean, this like terrified me to my core. And so like, and I love horror movies, but like there's something like really, like deeply scary about the Shaggy DA. So,
Oh, that's so funny. I can see
yeah,
why that could traumatize a kid. Like, I didn't get scared by a lot of things that most people would find scary. It's always something random that
yeah.
jumps out and scares you. Like for me, the traumatizing thing that like legitimately made me have nightmares for weeks was like 2 seconds in Aladdin where Genie turns into a zombie. I don't think it was supposed to be scary, but it traumatized me.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, I think the people with like imaginations, right? Like always like, find they take it one step further. So the really important art critic Ernst Gombrich called it the beholder share, that like art is only complete like when the beholder engages with it, right? So like a painting or a novel or a movie like it's not really its complete per thing until like somebody is like engaging with
Mm,
it, right? It's a like
hmm.
a deeply engaged person like takes it one step further, which is what you're describing.
Yeah. So did you have any like obscure old either Disney or it doesn't have to be Disney that you really liked or maybe want to recommend?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything right now. I'm sure I'll think about it like after we hang up. I mean, I will say it's been so fun for me to rewatch things with my kids, and I think every parent has this, but I took my kids to go watch a lot of the early Disney stuff at the Walt Disney Family Museum because they're always showing them on repertory, and it was so funny. My oldest son, he from when he was really young, like loved Donald Duck. And he's like, when he was like 2 years old, he would like imitate Donald Duck, like be like, "What's going on?" Sort of thing. And I couldn't. I was like, why does he like Donald Duck? Like Donald Duck is so annoying. Like like. And then it was so funny because then like 10 years later, he's 12 or 13 or something, and when we go to watch like some early Disney at the Walt Disney Family Museum, and then we come out and he's like, "Oh, this early Disney is so much better because Mickey is naughty."
Well, that kind of answers why he liked Donald so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah. So it was so funny. And then when we were watching the Snow White, so we were watching Snow White. Like I don't know when was Me Too, like 2018, like something like that. Like
Probably.
yeah, I think my son was about 7 or 8, and so and I think at his school, like Me Too was going on, and they were like already teaching, like you can't like do anything with somebody like without talk, like don't let whatever. I don't know what they were teaching at that time, but it was already like in the air or something. So we're watching Snow White, and at the very end, when the prince comes and like kisses Snow White to raise her from her slumber, my son goes like, "Oh, she's asleep. He shouldn't do that he shouldn't do that. Like, he should ask somebody first, like the dwarves or somebody." he like he like learned, he forgot the lesson about consent, that you like somebody has to be conscious to have consent. But then like he goes and thinks that the dwarf's going to go speak for Snow White. Like it's like an imperfect lesson.
I guess at least his heart was in the right place.
So, and I mean, so this is what great art does, right? Like when classics, like they continue to live on, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's interesting now, like I haven't watched The Jungle Book recently. I wonder, because now it's sort of The Jungle Book, like what else, like Song of the South, right? Like, um, these are complicated times, but I problematic as some imagery are, like I feel strongly that people learn more from
Mm-hmm.
seeing historical images than trying to pretend they didn't exist.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, with Song of the South, it's one of those. I did a podcast a few years ago on it. I think
Uh-huh.
most of us kind of agreed like the best parts of the animation, but it's kind of overhyped. like like everybody talks about either how controversial it is or how it's so terrible that Disney is hiding it, but it's like there are better movies than this.
Yeah.
Like the animation is great, but like
Yeah.
the rest of it is a bit boring.
Well, I mean, it's the same problem as, with Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, right? Like, super problematic, right, for all of its imagery. But, Griffith is like working out narrative continuity, right? So, like, so it's the same thing that you're talking about, right? It's not necessarily a great film, definitely doesn't age well in terms of its content, but for its historic, it was hugely significant for the evolution of the medium.
Yeah. That's why I don't like the idea of things just being hidden because they have a
Right,
problematic part
exactly.
of them. It's just like you go into something knowing maybe there's issues with it, but like there's still things you can take away from it.
Right. And and just to go back to Tyrus, I mean that's what I really admire about him was that he just never compromised on that.
Mm,
He was like, you know, right during Chinese exclusion, everything in the United States government was set up to push Asians to the margins. And what he did was he used his artistic ability to refuse to be erased, right?
yeah.
To make himself welcomed in American homes.
Yeah. He's such a cool, interesting person. It's nice that he's getting more exposure now, even though he's already passed on. Just like
Yeah.
he's one of those people is like more people need to know about someone who in their time weren't as appreciated as they should have been.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that as time goes on, I think he will be increasingly recognized not just as sort of this, really important person in Hollywood history, but really his really important figure in American visual heritage.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for doing this with me. This was a really fun conversation. Can you let people know where they could find you if they want more from you? And is there anything you're working on that we can look forward to?
Sure. So, you have anything related to the book is on the book website, alwayslookup.net. And that website name comes from a motto that was really important to Tyrus. And I'll let everyone find I think it's chapter 25 or something, to the secret to that motto. I am actually starting a new project on Dorothy Jenkins, who was Tyrus's good friend from art school. But Dorothy Jenkins was a three-time Oscar-winning costume designer. Among other things,
Hmm.
she designed the costumes for The Sound of Music.
Oh,
Um, and then they were actually at the WPA together. They were at Disney together, and she has also a fascinating story, but a completely different artist and creative from Tyrus. So I don't know what the final product is going to look like, but that's what I'm interested in. And people can always find me on my website, karenfang.net. And Background Artist is available through Amazon or at your local bookstore. As I mentioned earlier, the audiobook is also great for people who like to listen to their books.
who reads the audiobook? Do you know?
It's the great Chinese American narrator Caroline McLaughlin, and she does an amazing job. We worked really closely together. She does an amazing job with Tyrus's accent,
Hmm.
um, and just really sort of conveying, um, the story. Like, I wrote the book, and when I heard her read it, I was like, "This is great!" Especially because we're talking now in a moment of AI, where AI is like coming for all of our jobs and destroying creativity and everything. And I would just like to say that there is what an interpretive talent can do. You can't approximate that with a
No, I can
computer.
always tell when people are using it for even a voiceover in a simple YouTube short.
Yeah,
There's a difference. Like even as
yeah,
natural as they can make it sound, there's a difference. And the human voice, it just I would not want to listen to a whole audiobook done by AI. So, yeah, that's an important distinction. Like a good voice actor doing an audiobook makes such a difference. So I'm
yeah.
glad you got a good one. I'll have to look up. Like I am reading the book, but I kind of wanted to listen to the audiobook. Like that would I could do that in the car.
Yeah,
I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I'm also going through Pride and Prejudice as an audiobook, so I could add that to maybe the next thing after I get through that.
right.
Well, thank you so much for this interview. This was a lot of fun. I'll have to be on the lookout for your next project whenever that comes about.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for joining me. This was so much fun. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and follow my co-hosts as well. My link tree and all of our links will be in the description below. If you want more of my content, all my podcasts are available on YouTube as well as most podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this show, check out one of the other podcasts or check out my Patreon for bonus and extended episodes you won't find anywhere else. We'll be back soon with another brand new episode, so thanks for listening and we'll see you next time.